switch back to
recording in progress.
To teraz przełączę się z powrotem na angielski.
I will go to the plan of our meeting. So first we will have a short presentation from Katie, and also Katie, I think you will be the best person to introduce yourself. So I'm just saying hello, and you will have a chance to tell everyone who you are in a second. So we will start with a short presentation on the work that the Pride Foundation is doing, and what exactly are the goals and how they're achieving them. And then just like last week, we'll have 4 questions or discussion topics, and we will first ask Katie to answer them from her point of view. Then all of us will have a chance to discuss, to ask questions, to like express our thoughts on the topic, or ask like rhetorical questions and just point out that we have more questions than before. Everything is fine. So I strongly encourage everyone to ask everything and just share your thoughts, because it's the time like designed for us. There is no like strict agenda. We're just here to broaden our horizons in a way and exchange ideas. So every time that you have questions, it's okay. Like last time, if there were a moment when there were too many people trying to speak at once, you can always write on chat that you want to be next, and then I will make sure that you have a chance to speak and you won't be forgotten, and it won't be like everyone talks over you. So I hope it will work. We have 2 hours planned, and I hope it will. I mean, I'm sure it won't be enough to like, because we could talk for like I guess whole day, but I hope the 2 hours will be enough to get some ideas and some inspiration at least. So that's from the starting point of view. And my name is Clara Gubera. I didn't say that, but you all know that, I hope. So I'm here to like moderate our discussion today. And I mean, some people are still joining, but I'm not sure if we're waiting for someone.
I think we can start, Clara. Just a couple of advisory group members just told me that they will be trying to connect and reconnect because of some technical problems. So
okay, so I think we're good to go. So hello everyone, and hello Katie, and thank you so much for joining us. Just a fun fact, we have a 6 p.m. here, and Katie has 9 a.m. in Seattle, I think. So good morning, Katie. Yeah, and if you would like to start, that would be great. Also, let me know if you want me to share the screen with your presentation, or if you would be doing this on your own.
Well, thank you so much. I can go ahead and share if that's okay with you. I just want to start by saying hello and thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you all today. I'm very, very excited to be here. I am still drinking coffee this morning, so please apologize if I'm not quite as on top of all of the things as you likely all are, because it's 6 p.m. But I just wanted to start out with my gratitude for being invited to speak with you all and to share a little bit about the work that we're doing at Pride Foundation. And I am the most excited about learning from you all and the work that you're doing. I've gotten to really understand some of the work more over the past couple of weeks that I've been doing research, and it's just absolutely incredible. So I can't wait for the discussion part of this. So I will try to be brief as I give you all a little bit of an overview of Pride Foundation. But let me first start by saying my name is Katie Carter. I use she and her pronouns. I am the CEO of Pride Foundation. I have been with our organization for just now 8 years and been in this role for 3 years. So lots has happened over the past couple of years, and I'm excited to share a little bit more about the history of our organization and our work with you. And my PowerPoint presentation is in English. Is there anything that I need to do for translation of that, Clara?
No, you can just express, like say what you think, what you need, and just interpreters will just translate the voice, and we'll just look at your presentation in English. That's what we're doing.
Okay, fabulous. All right, let me go ahead and share. And can everybody see that? Okay, and I know that some folks aren't on video, so I'll make sure to read the slides out as well. Okay. So first, just wanting to start with sort of the heart of Pride Foundation is this idea that we believe fundamentally that LGBTQ communities and people should be able to be who they are wherever they are. These images here that you see on the screen are the 5 states that we work in. We're in Oregon, Washington, Montana, Idaho, and Alaska, which is the northwest corner of the United States. And while we work in just a small portion of the United States, there are such major differences in these different areas in which we work. There are very, very liberal, progressive areas in some of the major cities in this region, and where we have things like statewide non-discrimination ordinances, a big infrastructure of LGBTQ plus serving organizations in places like Oregon and Washington. But then in places like Idaho, Montana, and Alaska, there are big areas of rural communities. There are not that many LGBTQ serving organizations in those areas. And none of those states have statewide non-discrimination ordinances or protections. And there, as you all might have been hearing about, there have been a number of bills this year, over 200 actually, bills targeting our trans community. Several of those, unfortunately, were in our region. So there was one in Idaho, there's one in Alaska, there's 2 in Washington State. Last year, there were 2 in Montana. So while we have made significant progress as a community, at least on the legislative side of things, those rights are continually being challenged. In particular, segments of our community are being especially targeted and attacked. So just wanted to give you, there's a lot more I could say about the landscape, but I just want to give you kind of a sense that we're working across really geographically and politically diverse communities when it comes to the region in which we work. So just a little bit about who we are. Our mission is to fuel transformational movements to advance equity and justice for LGBTQ plus people in all communities across the Northwest. The vision that we have for our work is a world in which all LGBTQ plus people can live safely and openly as our whole selves in all of the communities that we call home. We're not there yet, but that is the world that we're working for. And really just giving a very, very brief snapshot of the history of Pride Foundation. So we were founded in 1985 in the midst of the HIV and AIDS epidemic here in the United States. And at that time, there were a number of people who were coming to Seattle to seek services and support. There were a number of folks who were dying from AIDS-related complications, and many of those folks actually left their estates and their resources to Pride Foundation, which enabled us to move resources back to the communities who were starting to sort of spring up in the late 80s here in the United States. That's when there really was sort of this like growth of LGBTQ plus serving organizations and larger movements happening. So we sort of began at the intersection of that. And our structure is a 501c3 nonprofit. So we are a charitable organization. We're a community foundation, which means, we are raising resources from the communities in which we are then reinvesting those resources back into. So we're like situated within the philanthropic sort of side of things, but we are still a nonprofit, just to give you a sense of our structure. This is just a graphic representation and sort of more visual look at what that means to be an LGBTQ community foundation and sort of the unique role that we play in the ecosystem here in the Northwest. And so in this illustration, you'll see all sorts of different people and connections between those people, from activists to community-based organizations, to organizers, to scholars, to our staff and board, to our donors. And so really what this is intended to represent is like, we are not a single monolithic thing, that we have these many different communities that we are working with and on behalf of and a part of. And this also represents all the different groups and the organizations and the movements for justice that we really are set up to be supporting. In terms of why we exist, so part of why we exist is because LGBTQ plus people aren't able to live safely, openly, and genuinely in all of the communities we call home. And that is our mission, to be able to change that here in the Northwest. So I want to just share a little bit of information that likely isn't a surprise to any of you, but LGBTQ plus people face significant inequities in nearly every area of life, from housing to healthcare to employment to educational outcomes. Like, you name it, there are disproportional impacts on LGBTQ plus people. And this is coupled with the fact that here in the United States, and this is true globally as well, is that there is a significant underinvestment and under-resourcing of LGBTQ plus people, movements, and organizations, right? So we are not only more negatively impacted when it comes to all of these different social indicators, but that we're also significantly underfunded. One of the statistics I often share in this moment is a national organization here called Funders for LGBTQ Issues tracks this data, so tracks the funding, and they have international reports as well, which seems like many of you have seen, which is great. But here in the United States, for every $100 invested by institutional philanthropy, only 28 cents goes to LGBTQ communities. And when you drill down even further into Black, Indigenous, and people of color LGBTQ organizations and trans organizations, it's pennies to the dollar. So this is sort of a stark reality that really underscores the reason why we exist, to help close this gap and to be a very specific and intentional funder of our communities, to make sure that we have the resources that we need to continue fighting for equity, justice, and liberation for our communities. At Pride Foundation, we also have a deep commitment to racial justice and intersectional anti-racism. This is from the recognition that our communities are not monolithic, right? There's this wonderful quote from Audre Lorde that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives. And so Pride Foundation has a deep commitment to making sure that we are always thinking about the intersections of what our communities are facing, whether that's around racism, whether that's around immigration, whether that's around gender identity. We're always trying to bring into our work the ways in which the multiple identities that we hold at the same time impact the kind of support and structures that need to be set up to fight for justice for our communities. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. There we go. Just really briefly, sort of an overview of our approach, and I'll go through each of these areas just briefly, but really our work is to move resources out into our communities as quickly as we can and with as few barriers as we can, right? Our work is to support the student leaders who are going on to pursue their education and make an impact in all sorts of different areas of work and life. And really underscoring both of those things is our work to shift culture so that our communities are included, safe, belong in all different communities that we exist in. And really underlying all of that work is the fundamental program that we have to mobilize resources, to fundraise, to make sure that we can move those resources back out to our communities and fund our programs. So this is sort of going over the different areas of Pride Foundation. One of our big areas, obviously, is our grant making work. So this is a big part of how we support groups and organizations on the ground. And we make grants to groups across the Northwest that are working passionately to meet the needs of our community and advance justice for LGBTQ people. We have a number of different grant making initiatives. Those have grown substantially in the past couple of years through support that we've been able to get through other foundations. And just to put some numbers to that, last year we awarded grants to more than 70 organizations totaling over $1.6 million, which is really exciting. This little graph down in the corner shows sort of that growth, that back in 1987, we awarded $7,150 in grants. And so over the course of the past 37 years, we've been able to substantially increase that. And we're on a path to exceed that again this year. So very exciting stuff there. And these are just some pictures of some of our grantees. The upper photo is Black and Beyond the Binary Collective, which is in Portland, Oregon. And then the lower photo is Glacier Queer Alliance, which is in Kalispell, Montana, which is a very rural area of Montana. This is just a quote from one of our grantees, that we reached out to them quickly and proactively, offering emotional and financial support. Offers like this are unprecedented, especially for small nonprofits like us. And that was from a group called Transponder, which is in Eugene, Oregon, that supports trans communities there. Another program that we have is our scholarship program, which is really the way that we support current and future LGBTQ leaders. And this work is really about making sure that our communities are resourced to pursue education, to grow their skill sets and grow their leadership, to be able to become leaders across a wide variety of areas, whether that's in medicine, whether that's becoming lawyers, or whether it's being running nonprofits, every single area. Just to share some numbers with that as well, the program began in 1993, and our first scholarship that we awarded was $3,680. It was the Brian M. Day Scholarship, which was for Black activists here in Seattle, Washington. That was in honor of Brian M. Day, who was a really prominent activist here in our community, who's in the upper picture there. And last year, we were able to award over $600,000 to 95 LGBTQ plus student leaders, which again, you can kind of see the growth of our work over the past several years. And this is just a quote from one of our scholars, that I grew up as a queer kid in a community with no visible queer adults, much less trans folks or community spaces for queer youth. Now I live in rural Oregon, working to create those kinds of supportive, accessible spaces for queer youth. And just a little fun fact, this quote comes from a person who is a Scholar alum and now also works for one of our community grant partners. So you can kind of see this cycle of how things are all interconnected. One of our other key programs is around culture change. And so we call this program Transform Culture. It really focuses on building up the storytelling, the messaging, the narrative building around BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, trans and non-binary in our communities. So we do this work in collaboration with a group of community leaders and members who we call the Village Council. So they are working, this is a newer sort of formulation of a program. So what they're doing is they're being trained as researchers. They will then be collecting stories from trans and non-binary folks across the Northwest about their experiences in healthcare, about their experiences more broadly in life. And from that, we will develop messages to really help build the narratives about who our communities are and the places in which we live. So this is really underlying our advocacy work, right? This is underlying our organizing work. We hope that that research will help to have a big impact on policy and advocacy. We hope that this work will also, we think of it as here during the marriage campaign here in the United States, there was a lot of talk about hearts and minds. right? About shifting culture, shifting hearts and minds. This work is similar, right? We know that legislatively, we are not going to be able to win in places like Idaho, Montana, and Alaska until we do major culture shifting work with communities there. And our dream and our hope for this work is that in the future, the bills like what we're seeing this year won't even have the space to take root, right? The legislators in those communities will have a better understanding of who LGBTQ plus people are, and trans and non-binary people in particular, and they will not even dream of putting forth this legislation. And then if it were to move forward, there would be such a strong community response and organizing in response to what was happening, using some of these messages and using some of these strategies and of narrative building to really shift the way that LGBTQ people are seen in different communities across the Northwest. And this is just a quote from one of our Village Council members, that being able to be part of a multi-generational group where I can sit across from an Indigenous elder, a Black trans femme activist, a Fa'afafine fellow organizer, having that beautiful blend of people and experiences has really stood out for me. And then finally, this is sort of the last piece of our work that we call resource mobilization, but this is really fundraising. It's a big core part of who we are. And one of the things that's important about this is it's not just about fundraising for our programs, right? Like the vast majority of our donors are LGBTQ plus people or close allies, parents of LGBTQ young people. This is our community as well. And they're investing in us because they are wanting to see change and see a difference across the region and the breadth of the work that we do. And so it's really, really, incredible. We think of our donors and the people who support us as, close partners in this work. Some of those folks, there's a couple of different ways in which people can become supporters, including by starting a donor advised fund, which I'm not sure if those are, it's sort of like I'm going to not go into the details of that. Sorry, I'm getting into the nitty gritty and I know I'm sort of at the time, but we get support from all sorts of different people, from individuals to our business partners. We get a lot of corporate support. We get a lot of businesses, both small, little local businesses who give a portion of, beer sales during Pride Month to Pride Foundation. And we have, much larger partnerships with Alaska Airlines, Microsoft, some of the bigger companies in our area. And we also get, as I mentioned, a lot of support from other foundations who are not LGBTQ plus specific, but are wanting to fund our communities, and they fund that through Pride Foundation so that we're able to make larger grants to organizations and sort of fund the breadth of our work. And this is just a quote from Carol Cheney, who is one of our supporters and also a board member, that she says, "For much of my life and work in social justice, I've had to choose between focusing on issues of race, gender, or sexual orientation. Pride Foundation is so intentional about tackling intersecting identities and create space for a person's whole self in this work." Okay, so that's a very brief overview of Pride Foundation. As I'm sure you all can relate to, it's very hard to sum up, decades of work and in just a few minutes, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of where we're coming from. But I just wanted to see if anything needed clarification or if there were any follow-ups that would be helpful.
I thank you very much, Katie. I actually think it was really clear structure of your presentation, and it sounds like it doesn't sound too easy to present so much of your work like in just such a short presentation. And also I just felt like, like as your organization being this long lost older sibling of our fund, because a lot of like areas that you cover with your work are very similar, and also the ideas that you presented are pretty much the same that I heard when I joined our fund. Like, yeah, we believe that we need to change hearts and minds, and then we can change legislation, all of that. So it's really amazing to, I mean, I'm just really excited to just start talking to you and discussing. Does anyone need to ask something about this part of, can we go on?
May I just have one question? Sorry, Katie, did I understand correctly? So this program about culture shifting is a part of granting program, or is it related somehow?
It's separate. So it's a completely separate program. There's overlaps, because as you might imagine, all of the work overlaps, that many of the members, the community-led part, the village council, many of those folks work at our grantee partner organizations, right? But they're leaders in their community. But that is actually a completely separate program that we started, just to give a little side note, because I think this is actually relevant for the rest of our conversation. So there was some legislation here in Washington State, which is, you know, one of the more progressive states in the United States. But in 2017, I believe, there was this slate of bathroom bills that were sweeping the nation, much like we're seeing right now. And there was a very prominent one here in Washington State. And so we launched a public education campaign. So not lobbying, but the sort of C3, that I'm not sure how much that translates to how things are structured, but like sort of nonprofits like Pride Foundation aren't allowed to do lobbying work or some of the legislative work. So it was in that vein, but really focused on public education to build the messages for the campaign that was fighting the legislation. So we did sort of the messaging, the research, the education part that is within the confines of the work that we're allowed to do because of our nonprofit status. And so that legislation got beat down, it didn't pass, was really wonderful. But what we learned from that is that the messages that were being used were focused mostly on white trans folks, were focused mostly on sort of gender conforming trans folks and not sort of the breadth of gender diversity that communities were facing, and really was creating messages that were more, I guess the word is like palatable, right? Or like that they believed would win the campaign. And so from that, what we wanted to do is to say like, well, let's do some of this research and narrative building that isn't about winning a campaign, that's actually about shifting the breadth of culture for all of our communities, and not only focus on, you know, these sort of messages that we think will move the most people. So it's a long game program is how I like to think of it, that we are trying to really shift culture in a deep way, but it is sort of like a very like decades long kind of a vision there versus necessarily, sorry, my dog, so it isn't necessarily focused at this point on particular pieces of legislation, though our team does help when legislation comes up in different states to be able to share some of those messages, to share staff time as we need it, those kinds of things.
Okay. Yeah, I got distracted by your dog. I had a question ready, but I lost this one. But I also, I mean, if you need Katie at any moment to talk about the political background that is happening, you can, because I'm not sure if everyone knows what's going on. And like you wrote on your website, I believe, like in your blog thing or something, that even the bills that don't pass still make a lot of harm because the narrative is already there. So it's really horrible. Even if the bills are not passing, even are designed like in a way that they can't be passed, like the damage is already done because the discussion is already there, and the headlines and all the horrible stuff that is being written on the internet is already there. So there's a lot going on in the United States right now. So if you need, like, if you feel like we should know something, then you can assume that we don't know it already, and you can just share these pieces of information. And okay, sure. So maybe going like to the first structured question, but I have like so many more that we didn't plan on talking about. So we will see how this goes. I'm a moderator, so we will see how it goes. But the first thing that we planned on talking about was like working with communities, community organizing, and also supporting communities. So my question was like just written like, why is it important? But it's way wider. But yeah, we could hear that your focus is on communities, like seeing the differences and also seeing like local groups. So why does your foundation, why do you choose to work this way? What is your assumptions behind this? And also, yeah, why do you do it, and how do you do it so well? I think that's the question.
Yeah, I sort of struggled with this one because I'm like, but that's just what we do. And I was like, how do I frame, like, it is our why, it's our fundamental why. This is where we came from. It's why we were created, was to support our communities. But to get maybe a little bit more specific, one of the things that is critical, that we believe very critically at Pride Foundation, is that the organizations and the groups of LGBTQ people who are supporting the communities across the region in which we're working are incredible, and they're brilliant, and they know what to do in their own communities. They know how to take care of the folks who are there. They know what services are needed. They know how to have conversations with their neighbors. And our job is to help resource them, because we believe that helping to build up that infrastructure of those groups so that they have, they're not all volunteer, so that they don't have to be all volunteer run and do this work in the evenings, right? That they get paid for that really critical work that they're doing. We believe that if we invest in that kind of infrastructure and growth for these groups, that all of our communities will be better off for it. And we also really believe that the people, this is often said in circles here, that, this isn't, I'm just naming, this isn't my idea, but like the belief that we have of the folks who are closest to the issues, closest to the problems, are best equipped to have the solutions of how to overcome them, how to move differently. So that's why we also especially believe in supporting small grassroots groups in different parts of our region who are trying to make change, and not to say like, oh, here in Seattle, we know exactly what you all should be doing over there in Bozeman, Montana. Like, this is what you do. We know that people in those communities know what's best, know how to support one another, and they are figuring it out. And our job is to resource them, right? And our job is to support the work that they're doing. And then a big part of our work is also to work within philanthropy to get more foundations, more people resourcing these groups, because they're doing incredible work, and they've made massive change with pennies, right? Like, this is, most of these groups started as all volunteer, really small. We started very grassroots before we were able to grow to this size, and look at the impact that we can have because people invested in us, because foundations invested in us, because our communities invested in us. And so that is part of what we believe. And, I also just want to, I want to say that, the building that infrastructure of support is so important, not only for supporting LGBTQ plus people through social services and other kinds of things like that, but that's actually where you get the groups who are fighting the legislation that's happening, who are, trying to run for office, who are trying to make larger systemic and political change. And so that's where resourcing those groups is really sort of, again, building a longer term strategy to mobilize for change. Does that kind of get to the question? I can speak more specifically about any aspect of that.
I think it answers the question also. I think these topics are so broad that whatever you say will fit the topic. I see Ola is already wanting to ask some questions, so maybe you can, Ola, go on.
Thank you, Clara. Yeah, Katie, I just wanted to ask another question about this community organizing, because I can assume that there are some part of Alaska, for example, right? Or Idaho or Montana or whatever, where you know that there are no LGBT groups or no LGBT initiatives, but still you want to probably do something there, or I don't know, just to be like an incentive for the local movement. So I just wanted to ask you whether you also do this kind of job. Just for example, you see that there is a whole area with no track record of LGBT activism, and you want to do something there. So do you do something there, in fact, or you just rely on the groups that are approaching you and asking for help?
Such a great question. And I think one of the things that used to be true is that in places like Alaska, Idaho, and Montana, our staff people who were based there were the only people who were being paid to do LGBTQ specific work. I'm very happy to say that is no longer the case. That was never a badge that we wanted to wear. Now there are groups in all of the states in which we're working. And so what our job has been historically is to find those activists and those groups. The quote from Transponder in the presentation, when I started at Pride Foundation, my job was to be our regional organizer for the state of Oregon. And so what my job was, and we have other staff members who do similar work then and now, is to travel around Oregon and find the people and the groups who were doing work in their communities. And I will say in our experience, there always was someone. Even in, I'm thinking of like Joseph, Oregon, which has, a population of a couple thousand, right? Like there were groups. There was a group there of people who were meeting. They weren't formal. They weren't, a 501c3 or anything like that. But, we helped talk to those local activists, figured out how we could resource them. It actually took a lot of convincing to say, like, could we give you some money to help with the work that you're doing instead of you paying for it out of pocket? And it took a while for folks to be like, oh, yeah, we do deserve this money. We could use it, right? And so, so really it was a matter of finding those different groups that were there, finding the people who had the ideas and were just looking for, and sometimes it's not money that people were needing, right? Sometimes they need to feel connected to other movements that are happening, other groups that are doing the kind of work. And so we really often play the role of that connector, right? Or to just say, what you're doing is important. Your work is really valid and meaningful and impactful. And like, please keep doing it. Let us elevate it to a broader group of people so that we can share what's happening, in different communities, in places. And so I guess that's one way of saying it. We haven't necessarily like gone into a community where there was nothing and said like, you all should start something here, because that isn't really the way we approach it, because we don't want to make those decisions for those communities, right? I think what we have done in those instances is just talk to LGBTQ people who are active in their communities there and asked the question of like, what do you need? Like, is there any support that you could offer? Like, what do you want to see be different? How can we be a support to that?
But in those times when you have these single activists as a paid staff, did they need a long time to establish the whole group there? Could you share the experience? Because I'm asking about, because we've been thinking about similar action in our fund. That's why I'm just trying to check whether it's a long-term goal, or I don't know, year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer, it does take a long time. And I think one of the things that is really critical about this too, especially if you're not from that community, I don't know if it's like this in communities where you work, but it takes a long time to build trust, right? To like believe that like you're there with authentic intention. And so building those relationships take time, right? Like the expectation that we have is that like the majority of our work is really about relationship building and trust building, and like funding is a piece of it. But before we even get to that funding part, there's so much that has to be put into like building those relationships with different groups, different activists, different ways of and understanding what is actually needed from the community there, which is part of why we don't like to come in with like the answers, because we don't live there. We don't know what, you know, we don't have a staff member in every little corner of the region. And so we need to ask a lot of questions and learn from those communities, but that takes time. And it also, I think, especially as those groups are trying to grow, like the group in Eugene, Oregon, Transponder, when I met with them 7 years ago, you know, they were all volunteer run. They were, you know, really small. I don't even think they were an official nonprofit yet, but it's only just now, 7 years later, that they have a part-time executive director who's being paid, right? The work has continued through them, but growing that infrastructure takes time. And that's part of why we, as an organization, are committed to doing multi-year grants, knowing that that helps organizations stabilize more, have more consistent knowledge of where their resources are going to come from, and make sure that they you know, can hire someone and say, we're going to have money next year to be able to pay you, right? So it just helps with that longer term work. So that's one way that we try to also acknowledge the length of time that it takes for growth to happen. And also the question of whether growth is actually what they want, right? There's a group that we've worked with for years and years that has a budget of like $7,000, right? And they don't have paid staff, and they don't want that. That isn't their model. They're not trying to become a bigger organization. They're trying to support what their community needs there through education in schools, and that's what they do. And that's okay too, because that's their choice.
Okay. Thank you.
I think it's so important what you're saying, like again and again, that the people know what they need, and also the organizations know what their needs are, and also the communities. And it's the best to just ask the community, or like just ask the community what it actually needs and what actually wants. And there's so much wisdom in this approach, and it's not very like it's like not everyone knows this, and I think it's really great. And I think it's also how our fund kind of operates, like not assuming that we know from Warsaw what communities need, but yeah, just asking them and asking what their resources are needed there. But I wanted to ask if you could maybe like tell us a bit more about, because you said you're the connector part between organizations, and I'm really interested in how you're supporting your grantees, and also even more, how do you create like bonds between them, and how do you link the organization? What's your role, and what do you do to do this?
Yeah, this is one of those things that you can be like, here's the big 4 buckets of our work, and then there's all the other stuff that doesn't neatly fit into any particular category. So we don't have like, this is exactly how we do that, right? Like we've hosted convenings, like where we've brought groups together before who were working in a similar place or in similar issues, to be able to share that information with each other. We've also been told that that other groups are like, we don't want that. We don't need that. We don't need that from you. And it's like, great. We aren't required, so we don't require it of any groups to come together. We always offer to do introductions, right, for groups, because one of the things, our vantage point is like, we're trying to do like these continuous landscape scans, right, to see like who's out there, what are they doing, what does it look like. And so when we're talking to another group, we might be able to say like, oh, there's a group in Montana who's doing something really similar. You might enjoy learning from each other. There might be resources that you can share. So we do that as well. We also have been trying to do more work connecting other foundations to groups who we think would fit well. So we've done a lot of introductions there to help get resourcing to happen. that work hasn't been as successful as we wanted, not for lack of trying, just because foundations are very slow to change their practices, right? And they see many of the groups that we fund as risky, whatever that means, right? Like, because they're not well established, or they're, not in, in their sort of portfolio of what they're used to. But we have like offered, support around grant writing. We sometimes offer letters of support for different groups to sort of vouch for them, which frankly, I don't think should have to happen, but we're happy to do it if we need to work within the current system to do that. And, more recently with our transform culture work, with our culture change work, we've been trying to help take a more regional perspective to the legislation and advocacy that's needed, because they are connected, right? Like, even though different states are dealing with different things, like one of the representatives in Idaho who drafted the bill that was focused on trans young people and preventing them from accessing gender affirming care, was sharing that information with other representatives in other states, was like sharing the language from the bill and proactively, trying to push these bills in different places. And so we're trying to like draw some of those connections and connect the groups in these instances in Idaho and Alaska, because they're fighting similar legislation in different places. And I think sometimes those connections are just nice to know, like, other groups are dealing with the same things that we are, but there also could be like, here is a strategy that we used in Idaho in case you want to try it in Alaska, for example. So that work is a little bit newer to us, and we're trying to figure out how to best continue to support our grantees while also making sure that we are doing that from, how do you say it? From behind, right? Like, we're not trying to be out in front pushing that work. We're trying to, do what we can to stand behind our grantees and create strong enough relationships where they will tell us what they need from us, right? And, I was in a meeting the other day, and folks one of our grantees was like, we need these umbrellas to be able, they wanted to buy these rainbow umbrellas so that people who were going in to access care, that you could like hide them from the protesters. It's something that happens a lot here at abortion clinics, where there's usually protesters out in front, and then anybody who's going into that clinic to get support services is sort of, it's just a way of kind of offering them support so that they don't have to be subject to that. So we were like, let's buy them umbrellas. We can do that. It's not usually that cut and dry of a thing, but like whatever they're needing, we're trying to figure out how we can offer it.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's so amazing listening to you, because it's literally the approach that we're trying to have also here. And yeah, I think we're more like on this level of finding out the needs, not yet like doing all this action, but yeah, just recently we asked our grantees, for example, what are the topics that they would like to just exchange ideas with other organizations, and we have already some answers, and yeah, they're just pointing out what's interesting to them, and we'll be just linking our grantees organizations just to talk with each other. We will be there just to open the Zoom call and just welcome everyone, because they are the ones that have all the knowledge and all the experience. And even the umbrella example, like we had very similar talk about like a projector for very like rural community, like very, very small. It's not like it's in a village, but yeah, Grześ and all our like if they need the projector, we can just let them buy it, and even if they watch one LGBT movie, that's fine with us. So that's really amazing to hear from you that this approach works. And it kind of gives me hope. But I also really believe that like just giving, like supporting people just by showing our support, by showing our trust is the best way to get more from them, because yeah, they know what. But I also think there's the other side to this. Like we also have knowledge that they don't have yet because they're just starting and they don't see a regional perspective, or they just don't know something. So that's also okay to like be the expert from time to time, not only to ask and only answer to their needs that they can like tell us, but also to have these broader ideas and to share with them from the expert point of view. I mean, not telling them what to do, but it's also, I think it's okay to share our ideas and resources because we have different point of view from them, just not trying to like change their minds, but just to exchange and to share.
Absolutely. And, I should have said too, as I was looking at your website, which I know is only like a small portion of like what, we can only put so much on a website, just like you can only put so much in a 15-minute presentation. But you all are doing incredibly like forward-thinking work. I feel like it's taken us decades to get to the place where we're doing work in this way. And I was just so struck where I'm like, oh, you're doing participatory grant making. You're doing like really thinking about how to support rural communities in deep and meaningful ways that are often cut off from other resources. Like, this is where I'm like, I think I have just as much to be able to learn from you all, because you're really doing the stuff that has taken us years to kind of build up this practice of what we're doing. So I think you're absolutely right that like we also have stuff, to your point, Claire, that we also have things that we can share with the organizations, and trying to be able to figure out like what that is that we have to share and the ways in which we can share it that are like mindful of the fact that like here we are, we're a foundation, we have resources, there's a lot of power involved in that, right? And really like navigating what those relationships, how that affects those relationships thoughtfully is a lot of what we worry about on a daily basis. So
I mean, I just wanted to say like, oh my God, same, because that's like exactly the question, like finding the balance between listening and being just like there, like in the second line, and also using the knowledge and like experience and resources that we have in the work with them. Okay, so maybe it's like good to go smoothly to the second question that we had planned, because it was just to ask you about what's your idea on the greatest challenges in working with local communities. And I think it's really interesting because you said that you work in different states that are very different from one another. So that is the question, and you have the floor.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges is just that, right? Like different communities need different things, right? And there has been such a historical under-resourcing that there are so many opportunities to build different things up. But I think one of the big challenges is really like how we can make sure that we're meaningfully showing up for all of the different communities that we're serving, right? Like the region that we're working in is relatively speaking massive, right? Like Alaska is like half the size of the United States, and there it is very, very challenging to make sure that we are getting to all of the different groups, people, activists. To your earlier question, Alexandra, like it is, we know that we're missing the opportunities, right? That there are groups, there are people, there are things that need to be done and that are different. So I think that is a challenge that we have, and just knowing that the way we approach our work requires relationship building, requires time, requires energy. Building that trust takes time, and just knowing that like this, while there's urgency to change so many different systems, so many different things, that there's also this need to go at the pace of that trust, right? Like we need to go slowly enough so that we're making sure we're moving thoughtfully and intentionally. I was trying to think of something like really profound to say as like our biggest challenge, but I think it's also just like the day-to-day of like making sure that we're staying in our lane, that we're doing the work that is most needed of us, right? I think there's often a question that I have said, and I've offered to my staff to like always think of like, if we're sitting at a table is Pride Foundation the right group to be there? Is there a local group that invited to that table instead of us or in addition to us, right? And so like always sort of evaluating like, what is our value that we're adding here? Is there more that we could be doing? Is there ways in which we could be, you know, passing the mic to another group, right, to be able to elevate what they're doing? And so I just think that's always like an ongoing challenge of making sure that our work is moving our mission forward, but that we're also doing it in a way that's in deep partnership. And just like any really, this is why I don't necessarily see relationships as a challenge, but I believe that relationships are hard, right? They take time and energy, whether we're talking about interpersonal ones or between organizations or within communities. And being able to fully understand the nuance of what's happening, especially in places where you know, we don't live or we aren't deeply embedded, takes a lot of time to really make sure we're navigating that thoughtfully and impactfully. So I think that's just a challenge. I mean, something my board says all the time is like, I wish we had people in all of those different places, right? And in some ways, I think that could be really great and impactful. And then you have to sort of weigh like, well, should we hire 15 more staff or should we give out, you know, several $100,000 more in grants, right? Like, so really weighing the impact of our work, I think, is one of the biggest challenges, and trying to figure out how to use the resources that we have most effectively, most impactfully, and, you know, making sure they're going to where they're needed most in our communities.
Yeah, I mean, because I don't remember what was exactly that you said that made me think of it, but I thought that like really what is really needed of the work that you're doing, and also I think we're all doing in a way, is the real like the high level of modesty, I would say, just going there and just being vulnerable and saying like, I don't live here, we don't know you, but we know that you do, and try to trust us that we won't try to like change your way of thinking. We just really want to hear from you. That may be really the challenge, to gain the trust and to stay like, to really not shadow those places, those communities with your way of thinking. I think that's a real challenge. And yeah, one way would be to just have staff there, but the other is really building the relationship. Okay, thank you very much for the answer. And I wanted to ask everyone, does anyone want to say or ask? O, Grzegorz? Grześ, jakbyś... English. Grześ, if you could like try a little bit, and we will see if the translation works because of the last week. So, okay.
To może najpierw zrobię test i poproszę o potwierdzenie.
Well, let's first do a test. Could you please confirm that you hear translation?
Did you hear the translation?
Yes.
Excellent. I think.
Ja w kontekście tej pracy w różnych społecznościach, które no, można brzydkim słowem prowincja określić, czy małych miejscowościach, małych społecznościach, my mamy taki wątek, który nam się często tam pojawia, a mianowicie zwracanie uwagi na bezpieczeństwo osób, które tam działają. Czyli żeby zwracać na to uwagę. W sensie w Polsce są to osoby, które mogą być narażone albo na jakąś tam wrogość otwarcie wyrażaną ze strony członków społeczności, albo wręcz mogą być na ataki fizyczne narażone, ale też pilnujemy, żeby mieć na uwadze to, żeby te ich działania nie wzbudzały takiej negatywnej fali komentarzy, które wywołają taki efekt mrożący, że po prostu osoba, która poczuła w sobie potrzebę działania, żeby to nie zostało zniszczone. I chcę zapytać, czy macie taki też wątek u siebie w swoich działaniach i czy jakoś przeciwdziałacie, zagospodarowujecie to? Dzięki.
I want to like underscore what an important.
Chciałabym podkreślić tutaj, jak niezwykle
Publicly has safety implications, right? Like we think about it for our own staff, in different communities that, you know, even saying where you work can sometimes be a liability depending on the community. I mean, when I used to travel a lot, depending on where I was, I would get the question often like, where do you work? And I always just said I was a consultant if I didn't feel safe, because sometimes you just don't know, and you're in the back of an Uber and you're not sure if it's how it's gonna go. And so I just want to name that is such an important piece. And we have been thinking about that a lot, especially over the past couple of years, and the ways that we can create safety for community members. And this is something, there's national conversations here around safety planning. We know that there are some groups in the region that we work in who have been, the groups themselves, not just individuals, have been, and the individuals at those organizations have been targeted for what they're saying. And we have always encouraged through one of our funds that we have, one of our initiatives, safety planning is something that we are interested in supporting organizations to do, right? And supporting those groups to do. We don't have a mechanism right now to be able to provide individual support because of the way the tax structure in the United States works. We're not allowed to give money to individuals. We have to give it to other 501c3s. But we have tried to create the space and the intentionality to be able for those groups to say, you know, we have a safety issue in our communities and our activists or our staff members are in danger. And there are national groups and local groups that are actually doing the, who help support developing those safety plans for different groups and organizations. Sorry, again, the dog. But I'll also say just unrelated to that, I'm so sorry. Okay, my partner is trying to take care of it. There was, in one of the communities that we worked, there was, I'm trying to remember exactly how this went. This was several years ago, but there was a desire by some people to put forward a non-discrimination ordinance, which is like the legal protections for LGBTQ people in that community. And community members said no. And not because they didn't want the legal protections, of course they did, but they knew that if that legislation came up in their community, that they would be targeted, right? That like they remembered from prior years when they tried to bring that legislation up in a very small rural community, that people who were visibly LGBTQ or were identified as being visibly LGBTQ by people were being targeted for violence and slurs and all sorts of negative things. And so I just want to also say that's part of why you have to really, really carefully listen to a community about what they're needing and wanting, because, you know, on the face of it, you're like, of course, we should have more legal protections in place. Let's move it forward, without thinking that actually puts shines a bright light on that community right there. And if you're not ready to provide safety and support services, it could really have negative impacts.
What you just said, Katie, reminds me of the situation that we had with one of our grantees, because we fund not only LGBT groups, or informal groups or organizations, but also people and groups who consider themselves as allies, right? So we would always want to support this movement, especially at the countryside or in smaller cities where there are no LGBT people eager to act, you know, in this visible way. And we had I don't know, a problem or something with one of our grantees, who is an ally, and she has lots of energy, is completely beyond our control, and she started doing things that provoke a huge backlash in her community, mostly, you know, against her. But on the other hand, I can imagine that there were plenty of LGBT people around her who were absolutely, frightened because of these events, and it's difficult, yeah. But we share this experience, as well, yeah.
Absolutely, and I think that's part of like the relationship and partnership building too, is in those instances to have built enough trust to sort of say, I know you think you're helping, but you're actually making it harder, and like, let's, step back and see if there's a better way that we can approach it. Those are not easy conversations to have, and people often won't trust.
Yeah, well, hopefully, nothing really bad happened. So this is good thing. But Grzegorz even had this kind of idea, to provide some kind of a training before disbursing grants, like the training about being a good ally, or training on good allyship in rural areas, just not to provoke any backlash and not to harm LGBT people from this community, in effect, right? So yeah,
a great idea.
Yeah, I think also Grzegorz started like an important topic about the communities where the LGBT like topic is non-existent, like it's a big taboo of a topic, and the community is pretending like it's not there. And I think that's really like big meta planning, how to start the conversation about like LGBT people in some community when there was nothing like before. And also and I think that takes a lot of planning, and that could be actually a good place for organization to come with some kind of like knowledge and data to show about like different transformations. Because I think, like you said, that for example, that historically there were places where there were non-organizations, and now there are some. So like the change took a lot of years. So it is not like it's not enough to bring one person and organize a pride parade. It takes like way more steps, and also I think it takes like a lot of careful planning, and also seeding the topic, not just planting the whole trees, but like seeding and waiting patiently.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also that, with time there comes just maybe the safety, because the topic is not so scary and new anymore. Ola?
Yes, I just wanted to share one another thing. It's a bit of question, a bit of sharing just our experience or reflection, because as you know, we are participatory grant making fund, so open for informal groups, even for individuals. We decided to open the call also for people who are acting alone in the communities. But we had this kind of conversation still in the fund, what is change, in fact, so do we need a regular local activism? So for example, should we invest in some kind of local informal group who has a chance to become a strong local movement for LGBT people? Or is it also okay to fund, a one action that happens in the community, for example, in the small rural community, but it is still a chance for kind of change, because every time when you start an open conversation, a community meeting, a discussion about LGBT people, about our rights, it is always a change, because it gives people a chance to meet with LGBT, with open gay or lesbian or whoever it is, and just talk for 1 hour, for 2 hours or 3 hours. And it's also an event for impact. I don't know whether you have this kind of reflection in Pride Foundation.
Yeah.
Is it this kind of one action worth of funding or not? Or you're trying to rather invest in in groups that are trying to, you know, have some kind of long-term goals?
Yeah, it's such a good question because for so many reasons, and I think for me at least, and for us at Pride Foundation, it's both and versus either or. And like this idea that both of those things, like you said, are change and are impactful. And I think about this story from many years ago where we have done a variety of different types of grant making. And at the time we were doing a participatory grant making where community leaders came together. But in this one instance, all the people were from one of the big cities in that state who were making the decisions. And they read the proposals, and there was this one group that was in a rural community in the state. And they had asked for a grant for like printing and for a banner and for a table for the different tabling events that they did at like fairs and things like that. And that committee was like, well, that's like pens and printing, and we should be funding this group that's supporting LGBTQ youth who were homeless, right? Like that's more important, that's more critical. And you know, talking to the group who unfortunately didn't get funding because the panel decided not to fund them, I had to go and rebuild that relationship because they just said, we really don't think you understand. We're in a community where being out is dangerous. And so us showing up at these events with our Pride, you know, banners is telling young people in those communities that they're not alone, they're safe. And so like I tell that whole story because I think it like helps us think about the way that our funding might unintentionally and the decisions that we make could unintentionally harm communities, but also that like both like that visibility piece, I think it sometimes can be hard to gauge change when we're like, oh, these legislative wins or this growth, like that's what change really is. When also like in many of the communities in which we work, visibility is still a huge issue, and the impact that has on young people, that on isolation, right? That so many people who are in rural communities decide to leave because they don't feel like they can stay there. And that's part of our mission, is that you shouldn't have to leave your home to be safe, right? You shouldn't have to leave your home to feel a sense of belonging. And so I think it's important that we measure change and we think about change on a multitude of levels, right? And that it's not only the long game, but it's also sometimes these smaller, impactful ways. And that's why I say both and. Like, I actually believe we need all of those different strategies in place if we're going to bring that change, the bigger vision that we have.
Thank you, Katie. I'm trying just to remember what you said about the visibility, because it's so important, and sometimes cannot be seen as important, and providing shelters or something else, but the community knows what it needs, and that's the whole wisdom. Thank you. And Magda, you're raising your hand.
Thank you. I think a question which Alexandra asked earlier just kind of led me to a question for you, Katie. I'm wondering if your foundation provides funds or funds projects run mostly by allies, and and that's because that's kind of I think was mentioned in the question, like about safety in the community and so on. So my question is, do you do that? And if yes, do you have different criteria or additional criteria? And do you treat those applications in some different way?
Yeah, Magda, thank you for this question. It's so, when Ola asked that earlier, I meant to circle back around that, because it's actually something that has changed for us over the past several years. So the sort of long answer is we do sometimes, and we do under particular circumstances, because oftentimes, especially in more rural communities, there isn't the critical mass, like the numbers there, to maybe have an LGBTQ specific organization, right? That is all set up there. Sometimes there is, and sometimes there isn't. It kind of depends on the situation. But there, historically, there have been sort of LGBTQ programs that are embedded in like much larger healthcare systems, for example, or youth serving organizations having this program within it. And so we have historically been much more open to funding those, but we've actually shifted that over the past couple of years to really focus in on LGBTQ-led and serving groups as opposed to ally groups. And not because those ally groups aren't important or aren't doing good work, but because they often have access to more resources, right? Because they're not LGBTQ specific. So they have other funders, they have lots of individual donors. So large ally organizations are not groups that we fund anymore, just because we know that they have additional resources and other places that they can get support other than through us, which isn't to say we don't partner with them or we don't appreciate their work or we don't elevate the work that they're doing or the impact that it's having. But when we think about where the relatively limited amount of resources that we have are going to go, our belief is that if we invest in those LGBTQ-led organizations, then they tend to be cut off from other resources, right? Especially in places outside of our major urban areas. They might not have individual donor bases that they can draw from. So it's kind of our sort of a strategic decision that we're like, if we invest more in these groups, we think that the impact will be larger, but it's something we grapple with, right? Because especially in rural communities, we know that sort of groups that are serving a breadth of the community are like the only game in town, so to speak, right? Like they're the only resource there. And so what we've sort of been hoping is that us not funding them isn't going to make them go away, but we're keeping an eye on that, because if that's wrong, that's also a problem, right?
My question is also because I think with the large institutions, it's sort of easy, especially if they have a good funding or structure and so on. But what about small initiatives? You know, if you have, do you see those at all? Maybe you don't see those, but I think we see them a little bit, that, you know, there will be allies saying, oh, we just want to do for these communities, and actually LGBTQ plus people are not really visible in our community, but we want to do something for them. And then, like, do you fund this, or do you have also some kind of objections, and what your strategy and thoughts are on that?
Yeah, I think if it was that situation, we would ask a lot of questions. Like, did LGBTQ people ask you to do this? Like, who are the LGBTQ people who are involved in your organization, right? I think we get nervous when there's a group who's doing something for our community and not with our community. So I think we would ask questions around that. Though I will say that hasn't come up too much. But you know, that doesn't mean it's not happening. It just might mean they're not coming to us for funding. Maybe a more consistent thing that we've seen is there's a group called Rural Organizing Project in Oregon that has been one of our grantee partners for decades. And they sort of were founded with this fundamentally intersectional like structure and belief system. And so the way that their work is they help organize activists to build what they call human dignity groups all across rural parts of Oregon. And the issues that those human dignity groups work on are issues around immigration, issues around LGBTQ communities, issues around white supremacist organizing that's happening in rural communities. So around all of these different social justice causes, but they do it in this intersectional way because they believe they'll build more power for the local communities by doing that. And just a little anecdote, like I remember when I was a organizer, when I was like a program officer, I sort of got in an argument with our director of programs who said, well, they're not LGBTQ specific and they're not doing that work. And I just was like, but they're working intersectionally and they are like one of the strongest organizations supporting LGBTQ people in rural communities. And we will make a big impact by continuing to support their work. So I think that has been something we just grapple with as an organization and sort of think through, but also knowing that we're wanting to build relationships with allied organizations. And I even think about like, I don't know if you all we have these things that have been called gay straight alliances or queer straight alliances in schools that are like groups that are trying to sort of create safety by having allies and LGBTQ students who are all part of the same group and sort of build community that way. And so we've seen, and we funded some of those groups when they need different kinds of funding. So I know that like, I want to say, like, I think this is something we're going to continue to grapple with and think about, and especially as groups approach things really differently depending on what they're working with, right? Like we funded, like there's a couple of organizations who are focused on, we do a lot of funding in for immigrants and refugees, right? And there's some organizations who are set up specifically to work on immigration here in our communities that aren't LGBTQ specific, but they started building out LGBTQ components to their work. And we have funded those groups, right? Just as one example. So we don't have sort of a hard and fast policy around this. We have to sort of look at the group, think about who's involved, think about the impact that they're making. And in those instances, you know, that the group in particular that I'm thinking about was, you know, run by a trans woman who, you know, was deeply embedded in community and who was working on, you know, her sort of vantage point was working on immigration, but really making sure that LGBTQ people were fundamentally a part of that work. So I think that's really like our main question that we ask ourselves are like, how are LGBTQ people a part of this work if it's not LGBTQ specific organization?
I just want to say that we had the same experience in the fund, in our fund, and we had two initiatives that applied for grants during the first call that we organized in our fund in 2020. And they received the feedback from the other initiatives that assessed their application, that, you know, despite the good intentions, they just do not have LGBT community in the application. So there is no, maybe there are some chances, but there is no sign of this community being involved in the application. But the feedback was, you know, very, I would say, very friendly, a real feedback, a real gift for them. And they came back for second call with the local LGBT movement involved. So it was as a mixed group, not just as allies. So it was really impressive. I was really stunned by the research, diagnosis job they did there, and it was amazing. Yeah.
That's awesome. And I feel like that's also like such like thinking about the question earlier about like, what is our role and how do we play it? I think that's an incredible example of being able to say like, oh, we see that you're wanting to support LGBTQ people and movements, but you need to have them as part of the work in order to be able to do that. So I think that's just such a great example of like what our roles can sometimes be.
Yeah, and so sometimes you know, this feedback is very, very harsh, and we have to do a lot of with Grzegorz mostly to, you know, just to soften this feedback for other initiatives, because we still think it has to be a real feedback, a real gift, not just, you know, insulting other people.
That's right.
For their intentions and their ideas, but And we are still trying to work on this feedback, on the rules of this feedback, and on the frame of this feedback. So we're still trying to be very just to have a reflection on that, constant reflection on that.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can maybe try to move to another topic that we have two of left. I'm not sure if we'll do both because we have like half an hour left, but so maybe let's do the one that I had planned as last, but so a bit of switch up. So I wanted to maybe not even ask you, but just ask you to talk about narratives and how do you develop narratives that you use in your work, and also do you differentiate, do you do different in different communities, or is it different because of the goal that you want to achieve? Also, maybe if you work with your staff on developing narratives, also how do you do that?
Yeah, there's so many answers to this question. I think one of them is we believe that building narratives is so important that we launched a whole program about it, right? Like this is what our Transform Culture program is really focused on doing, is building those narratives. And part of, I shared a little bit about this, but part of why we launched that work is we find that so many of the narratives that get built about our community are getting built for winning particular campaigns that use messages and narratives that will get that legislative win, right? And that will ensure that, it makes people comfortable enough to vote for that. And that isn't authentic, right? That isn't representing the breadth of our communities or the reality of our lived experiences. In LGBTQ movements here, and I'm sure in other places, there's been a lot of conversation around this idea of assimilation, right? Of kind of blending in, and especially after we won marriage, there was a lot of really reasonable critique of our broader national movement, that that was the only thing that so many of members of our community were fighting for, which really only impacted, gay and lesbian folks. It didn't, positively impact trans folks who are trying to access healthcare or safety or employment or any of those things. It didn't help people who weren't, middle class or wealthy, right? Who were trying to access services or housing or things like that. It doesn't necessarily help the breadth of our community, but it was such a big focus to get that legislative win. And I'm not saying it's bad or the wrong thing to fight for, right? It's not, but it's just not the only thing that we should be fighting for. And I think this is where building narratives that are representative of the breadth of communities, right, and breadth of realities that LGBTQ people face is so important. And here in the United States, up until recently, most of the media examples, on television and in stories that people accessed, were of white people, cis people, wealthy people, living their best life. Ellen DeGeneres is an example of this, if you all know her. And it's not bad. I'm not saying she's bad or anything like that, but that's not everybody's experience, right? And if that is your only understanding of LGBTQ people, you don't know that, nearly half of all of the young people in our country who are homeless are LGBTQ, right? That is a truth. And once we only have a monolithic view of our community, it invisibilizes the lived experience of so many people in our communities. And so this is part of why we're very intentionally building out this entire program that will focus on collecting the lived stories of people, right? So that we can represent the breadth of what our communities are facing, and not just in terms of the negative things that we're facing too, but the joys, the celebrations, the ways that people have built incredible things for themselves and for their communities, right? And so I think we think about that in terms of that's the whole reason for the program, right? But we also think that that is like the foundation for how we will shift culture, because the legislative wins are important. Like, don't get me wrong, like they are very, very, very important. But, you know, we live in a place where I live in Washington State, and we've had a non-discrimination ordinance here for, 14, 15 years. That doesn't change the experiences of everybody, right? Like that does not always translate to the lived safety or the lived feeling of inclusion, or being able to go to a doctor who knows how to ask the right questions and knows how to support you when you're needing healthcare, right? Or a million other examples. And so I think that the movement here feels like it lost a lot of steam, and it literally lost a lot of resources after we won marriage equality, because that was the focus for some people who, like, that was their most important thing for them in their lives. And that even in our own community, right, we have to do so much education of what people's experiences are that are not their own. And so that is also, like, in our communications, right, like the majority of the people that we are speaking to through our newsletters and things like that are LGBTQ people, are very close allies. But we're trying to make sure that even our own community is aware of and understanding the different experiences for trans and non-binary people, if they're cis, or for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, for white people, right? Like, to make sure that we're thinking outside of our own experiences. And so much of that happens through making sure to represent those experiences and the narratives that you choose to share. That kind of, I just could talk about narrative building for so long, because I think it's such an important part of the work. And I've been really excited to see more funders in the United States starting to fund this work, and not only funding it around campaigns, right? Like funding it around, like, how are we actually shifting and building the narratives for a variety of different issues and communities.
Ola is
I just wanted
trying to
to
say something, so I will say something later.
Sorry, no, glad. So maybe you, do you want me to? Okay, sorry. So I just want to say that your story, what you said, you just reminded me of the fact that when you won the marriage equality in US, it was a huge event for worldwide, I think, and there was I remember the discussion within the Polish LGBT community that it's absolutely great, and also the rate of LGBT youth coming out raised, but on the other hand, also the rate of homelessness within this community of youth LGBT youth raised, because their communities were not, I would say, or couldn't respond properly to this youth coming outs, right? So it was the side effect of this marriage equality, I think, in the US.
Yeah, it was I worked at Pride Foundation when we won marriage equality, and it was like such a win. And I remember also being terrified in that moment that people and organizations were going to pull their funding, because they're like, done, good, right? And we've seen that happen, right? And we're like, so every message that we put out is like, let us celebrate this really monumental win and remind ourselves that we are not done, that there are members of our community who are still facing all sorts of things that we need to change, right? And I think part of what is happening right now is that the legislation, like 200 bills that are focused on targeting trans communities, right? That's double from last year. Like, there has been, the backlash is like, okay, they realized that they couldn't, that the conservative groups couldn't beat us around marriage anymore, in part because we found really strong messaging that worked, right? Love is love, right? Like that message was like a thing that all of a sudden people couldn't fight back against, and it worked, but they just changed their tactic, right? And so instead of attacking, you know, LGBTQ people wanting to get married and all of that, the landscape changed, and now they're attacking trans people and using this like totally inane legislation and making up issues that aren't even there, right? Around like, you know, trans girls participating in sports. And so I just want to also like underscore that the reason that legislation is happening is so disingenuous, right? Like they aren't really worried. I mean, this isn't a surprise to you all, right? Like they're not really worried about protecting youth sports, right? They're not really worried about protecting young people who are looking for gender affirming care. They are using a particular audience who they know is going to be a wedge for Americans, and using that as a wedge during, you know, we have elections this year. And so this is part of why it's coming up. And so this is also where, like, I wish we could be a little bit more forward thinking and understanding that, like, that what is being attacked isn't just like marriage equality or these other things, that there's actually like a coordinated effort to try to use our community to mobilize a base for completely other political issues, right? Like LGBTQ people broadly have been you know, a group that our legislators could point at and say, you know, like, you know, make judgments and make different kinds of laws against us, not because they actually care about us, right? It's because they know that that will get people to the polls and vote for them to continue doing their work in office, right? And so just always being mindful of the way that I think the marriage equality win was also an opportunity for a lot of folks to bow out of the movement way before we achieved any of the things that we needed to achieve, right? Like right after that, people were talking in so many of the states that you could get married on a Saturday and get fired legally on a Monday, right? In so many parts of our country still. Sorry, I'm getting a little worked up there, but yeah.
No, it's totally fine that you're getting it. Also, I think we can understand you pretty well because you know about like situation in Poland, and we can really understand what it means to use our community as just a topic for everything, and just having like someone to blame for every single reason. But Magda, you're raising your hand. Do you want to say something?
Yes, because when you were talking now about the situation in USA, it's something I will make a little jump to narrative if I can, like connecting those topics. Because, for example, for my initiatives and my organizations and community here, it's also something about, for example, how TERF movement is getting more stronger and stronger in Poland. And because in Krakow, for example, we have like a strong group of people on the university, and it's really difficult, for example, to build a narrative against them. So it's something also that we are aware that, and we're thinking a lot about what can we do and how to change this narrative around, for example, like the TERF movement, what is in the, and they're also like in the mainstream media. So because we know that it's like the first step when it comes, and then the second step will be what is happening now in United States, for example. Yeah, that there will be like it's really close to the, for example, like legislative like this. So yeah, it's like also like a big challenge, I think, for us, also like for like an allies for the trans community and non-binary community. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you're so smart to say that like that TERF activism precedes this legislation, right? It lays the groundwork for these more intentional attacks, because it is like, frankly, it is all narrative, right? Like they are creating this completely false narrative about who trans people are. And I think the only way we can combat that is by countering those narratives with the true lived authentic experience of the breadth of folks who are trans, non-binary, gender diverse, all of the different ways that people identify. and elevate those as valid, right? And like part of one of the things that like from more movement work that happened here is that, and this happened with marriage equality, but it also, there was some research done that showed like the way that you help combat some of that work is by actually knowing people in your community who are LGBTQ, and in this instance, who are trans or non-binary. And I think this is where kind of the rub is like, you know, you can't also like send trans folks out to all sorts of communities and like door knock and be like, hello, I'm a person, like validate my humanity and all of these different things. And so one of the things that we did is we did a partnership with Facebook that it's a long story, but it was like using virtual reality videos that actually were like these narratives. It was called Authentically Us, and it's the story of 4 different trans folks who live in our region, and people could go and actually like watch these videos and feel like you can watch them in non-virtual reality too. I've never actually seen them in virtual reality. I've only seen them, you know, as like little movies or vignettes that help people understand and see trans people, right? This is why, coming back to the visibility, this is why it's so important that we have, you know, shows like Pose, that we have Laverne Cox, that we have Janet Mock, that we have these really prominent activists who are, you know, forcing the conversation to be different than what it was when trans people were forced to sort of be in the shadows. So I'd be happy to share those videos if that would be helpful, but I think, I don't know if there's more I can offer there, except that like that is the only way that we can kind of combat that, is by actually sharing the lived experiences, but also thinking about safety in that, thinking about the ways in which the visibility and safety question that we've talked about can be so pressing.
Thank you, Katie. And another Magda is raising her hand, so please.
Thank you. I don't really have a question, but I would like to share something. I'm not sure if it's helpful, maybe not, but I thought I will. A while ago, I had the opportunity to be in the kind of meeting of activists from different areas in the UK. And, you know, the subject of TERF movement and the narrative of that trans women are not real women kind of emerged. And I just remember a comment which surprised me at the time, but now when I started thinking about this, it all made sense. Said, you know, one of the women present there said basically that, you know, 30 years ago in the UK, or 40 years ago in the UK, there was narrative that lesbians are not real women. That was the real thing. You know, that was the discussion. So in a one way, that really surprised me. But on the other hand, maybe this is something we could look at, right? I mean, obviously 40 or 30 years, it's a long time. But at the same time, we know that things change. So maybe we can take lessons from that.
I didn't know that. That's very interesting to think about.
I fell off my chair when I heard that, but yeah.
But I think this is also where like deepening our conversations and understanding around gender, like we know that there is power in that, right? There is power in trying to deny someone's gender by saying like, oh, you're not a real woman because you're a lesbian, right? Is bound up in the fact that like you can only be a real woman if you like have sex with men, right? And like that's not true. And so like thinking too about like what's underlying those arguments, I think can help us. I mean, the TERF arguments are just like people who, there's so many different folks, and I'm very sad to share that like so many of those are within our own community, right? Like it's not all like they are folks even within the LGBT community, right? Who are espousing some of those beliefs. And I think that just goes to show the work that we even have to do, in our own house, so to speak, that to combat those narratives and those understandings. And it comes from people not having a strong understanding of gender, or how gender works, or how gender's worked in their own lives, right? Or even, awareness around that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've been waiting a second to see if anyone wants to say anything, like something else. Yeah, I think like coming back to your first answer in a way, but also like having like listening to all this conversation, I think it's really important to remember what you said about like the visibility and the narratives that actually show different people, the real people. And also it's like the Ellen example, I think is really powerful, like to think like, yeah, this is a lesbian, but it's not all the community, and she's not really representative of a community, and the education within the community is also a big thing. But I really liked what you said, that like creating the narratives not only based on the suffering and the problems that are there, but also just like on real life, and also like all the achievements, and just showing the humanity in both like problems and both also in joys and just in love. Actually, I think it's kind of, maybe won't say that deep, but it's really kind of typical for Polish culture to create this suffering narratives. Even when I think about what we learn in high school, like 19th century literature and all the wars and all different things in our history, Polish history is all about suffering and trying to fight some enemy, and us being the greatest sufferers of the world. And I really think it got old on this way of creating narratives, and it's really important. But at the same time, I can see someone, like you said, the big win that some people assume that it's all that there needs to be done. Like at least you have some win now. Let's move to communities that have no wins at all. So there is probably the danger in showing like the good stuff. Like, yeah, we are happy. So okay, so if you're not that scared, you're not scared to kiss your girlfriend on the street, then we can move to someone else who has nothing. So I think it really needs like a lot of balance, but I think it's really important to not stick with suffering and problems, but also showing the real life and humanity behind all us, all the people, like people behind all the letters in LGBT plus shortcut.
Absolutely. Like, yes, at 100, I couldn't agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that, like, to be honest, most of the narratives here around our community have been around, you know, suffering and oppression. And it's been more recently emphasized that we need to tell the full story of who we are, the contributions that we've made, what we're capable of. Some of that is like through this like complex idea of resilience, right? Like, but our resilience comes from what we've had to overcome. But I think that isn't the only thing we have to offer, and like that isn't the only truth about our lives. And I always just think about, like, if those are the only messages that we hear about ourselves, or that young people hear about our communities, like what does that tell us about what we might be able to have in the world, right? And so I think it's also like a mindset, and I think about it for like our own mental health as LGBTQ people, right? Like also reminding ourselves that we get to experience joy, we get to see beauty, we get to like be in celebration with our communities, because if we don't have that, it's going to be really hard to keep going and keep doing all of the work that we know is in front of us. So I think, like you said, having that balance of like acknowledging the wins and celebrating the wins, but also not letting that like sort of dampen the momentum that we've built too, and using the celebration and the joy as fuel to keep going.
Yeah, that's true. It's really true what you said. Like, yeah, the narratives that younger people, for example, see, and also made me think about the parents of kids, that like kids coming out and the emotion that they have. But also, this made me think about like probably the narratives that we create and choose to present is also like it really creates like forms, maybe relationship, or even the image of the community for other, like for lawmakers, or I don't know, you know, allies or anyone, and presenting only the hard stuff and problems could actually form a relationship based on pity, for example. And
yes.
I don't think it's really the emotion that we want to form like the relationship with LGBT plus community on. So probably also when thinking about this topic of narratives is also like what relationship can be built on that. It also makes me think a lot about the Ukrainian things right now. Like it's not like it's a long shot, but it really made me think that about how Ukrainian people, Ukrainian army is presented as strong and like not only having problems but also just being strong and have like high morale. And it really shifts, like it really gives hope to everyone. I think once the community believes in them, then for example, when the narrative is created that they are able to fight and they want to fight, then the resources come to them to help them within this fight and like on this route. But maybe it's like a bit too far for this conversation.
I think it's a really powerful testament to the way that narratives shift what we believe, what people believe, what we believe about ourselves, what people believe about us, like what motivates us. I mean, I think to your earlier example, right? Like this is like a personal story, but when I came out to my mother, you know, even though she like identifies herself as an ally in the world and like that was where my exposure came from. But what she said to me is, I don't want this for you. I don't want you to have this life, because all of the narratives that she had received are that if you are queer, your life is going to be bad. Things are going to be hard. You're going to be in danger. Right. And like, but what a message to tell someone that like, you don't want this, like, like my life is amazing. Right. For like, even when it has been hard and all of those things, I would not be able to be who I am. The idea that it would be better to hide who you are than to live this out life is just such a sad narrative, right? And to think about the way that shapes what is possible for us or what we believe is possible for ourselves, right? Like this happens in our scholarship program a lot and is often the feedback that we get from our scholars is that, you know, many of them have been rejected by their parents, have been financially cut off by their parents, right? And this gives them sort of they're like, yes, the money is important and we appreciate the tuition support, but what is most important is to have a foundation who believes in us and to know there's an entire community of people who believe in us and who know what our potential are. And so I think about that too, in terms of the way that narratives can shape what we're capable of.
Yeah, and on this conversation, like, made me kind of remember, you know, the name of your foundation, and also like the movement, like LGBT pride parades. It's supposed to be about pride and joy and celebration. I think it sometimes gets a bit maybe lost between all the problems and day-to-day fights, but it is supposed to be about pride and joy and like being out and happy. And that's like so simple because yeah, it is pride, but like even seeing the word on screen, we can still forget this. So maybe that can be a reminder that when it's a Pride Month and Pride Parade, actually think about what the pride is. That was
I forget that sometimes, so I appreciate you reminding. Like, that's true. That is what that means. A word that I say 1,000 times a day to remember what the actual meaning is behind it.
You're welcome. Okay, I mean, we had another whole topic planned, but we also have 5 minutes left. So maybe just to tell everyone, I wanted to also ask you about local advocacy, and it's also something that you said a little bit about. But I'm thinking right now that there will be probably a chance to ask you about this on our second webinar with community. So maybe like not all is lost and there will still be a chance to talk about this. So we have a few minutes left, so I think it's the perfect time for some questions or just, you know, free-flying ideas from everyone, and also maybe someone who haven't spoken yet. Maybe there's a person who would like to share something, and if not, then Ola, you're the first one to have the floor.
I can wait, really, if there is anybody else who would like to say something or ask a question.
Okay, maybe Ola, go on and...
Yeah, okay, thank you. So Katie, I just wanted to come back to this narrative and research issue. You mentioned at the beginning, I think that you your foundation is doing also research for building narratives, right? And I think it's extremely important because in Poland it's a still new discussion, I think. And I don't know if you can elaborate on that. I just want to say that a couple of months ago, I participated in a very nice meeting with Freedom to Marry and Freedom to Marry global leaders. It was, of course, we have Iwan from the Global Freedom to Marry and a guy who is responsible for the communications and campaigning globally. And what was interesting that they told the audience about the campaigning in California and preparing for the marriage equality, some campaigning there. And they were really stunned because they did some kind of focus groups. And in this most liberal and progressive state, they heard that people are not very pro marriage equality because all these gay activists are still talking about rights. And what people want is some kind of emotions and showing, gay people as human beings, not just focus on rights and privileges, right? And so they tried to deepen the research, and they found out that there is this golden rule is very important for people in US. So the golden rule is like treat other people like you want to be treated as well, right? Something like this. If it's if maybe I lost something in this rule,
right.
But it's right. Okay, thank you so much.
That's right.
And what was really interesting that they also did research in different countries. So I think they were also responsible for supporting marriage equality in Taiwan and in Costa Rica as well. And the result of the research about the values were quite the same in those areas, which was also very interesting. We did a research in fund in Poland last year about the narratives about allyship and being ally and how is to be ally and why people are allies with LGBT people. And the value that we found out is a very, I think, taken from the Catholic upbringing. So it's just the basic respect for other people, for other person. I don't know if you have this kind of experience in your foundation. Maybe you can also tell me something more about that.
I mean, that's so fascinating. I don't know much about the international research that has been done, but it's almost like a foregone conclusion at this point that we don't talk about rights anymore, because we know when we're thinking about narrative building, because we learned that lesson during marriage equality. That's where I mentioned where they shifted to the Love is Love campaign from fighting for our rights. And every time I say it, I always hear in the back of my head, like, this isn't going to move people. And it's kind of bizarre when you think about it, right? Like, you think that this, especially in the United States, where the democracy and like everyone getting to have rights should be such a thing that we should be thinking about and fighting for, but those aren't the messages that move people. And so a lot of our research has been about what are the messages that move people to change their beliefs, to change their behavior, to change their actions. And I think there is truth that like the messages have to be personal, right? Which is why we focus on individual storytelling and narratives, right? The beliefs have to create a feeling of empathy. And so trying to find, like, this is where, like, in our own work around this, we've had to really grapple with the tension specifically around how you cultivate empathy, right? Is that like, what are you sacrificing for people to be able to empathize, right? And this is where I had referred before to like not wanting to just only create palatable narratives, right? Or narratives that were easy and comfortable and relatable, because we also need people to think about things that might make them uncomfortable or might mean, because if you're uncomfortable, you're growing, right? Or like growth isn't going to happen, change isn't going to happen without a little bit of discomfort or maybe a lot of discomfort. And so this is what we're trying to figure out right now, is like, how do we build different narratives? How do we build different messages that will shift people's opinions meaningfully in a place, especially where like those opinions have become very, very polarized, and people are like firmly embedded in their understanding. And so I think this is what we're actually trying to do right now, is to try to figure this out when it comes to gender identity and expression in particular. And not to say that we've completely won, or everything's okay around sexual orientation, but there isn't the same amount of research around how we shift people's understanding of gender, right? And we even sort of initial research around this is like, you have to do all of this pre-work before you even get there, because many cis people have never even thought about the fact that they have a gender, right? Or think about how that gender came to be shaped or impacted. And so there's all of this like deep work around binaries that you have to get to. And so this is what we're trying to figure out. And as we develop that research and develop some of those narratives, we'd be more than happy to share what we're learning too from that. I want to know what that research is. I'm like, oh, what have they found in different places? I think we could learn a lot about the ways that what is common among those narratives, like what is working in many different cultures and communities and countries.
Well, I think it was also a bit stunning for them. It's not a typical golden rule in Taiwan and Costa Rica. There's some slight differences, but this is very, very, the same values, almost the same values are also important, or were important for the successful campaigns in those countries. Mm. I can send you a very nice link to this debate if you want. It's a bit secret, but I will send you.
Which is, I mean, this is true, right? So much of the messaging work is secret, because you can't, what we're doing is trying to shift these narratives, right? So I would really appreciate reading that. That's fascinating.
Okay, we've run out of time, so it's like the last chance if anyone wants to say something today and not have to wait a month. But I think, yeah, everyone seems to be just listening and enjoying. So yeah, it's time to say thank you very much, Katie. Like, to me personally, it was really an amazing opportunity, and I have so many thoughts, and I actually want to rewatch the recording just to make notes and then have something to think about. But I also think there were a lot of points that we will use in our organization discussions, because there's a lot of stuff that is really similar to us, and also some that is different, and we can actually reflect if it's something that we want to use or not, because of different circumstances. Thank you so very much for joining us today. And also right now I would like to also acknowledge and thank the translating, like the interpreters team, and also the transcription team, because everyone had like chance to participate in any language they needed. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone. Also thank you for your questions and for being so like talking and taking active part in this, and also those who were not, just for listening, because we know you are there. And once again, thank you, Katie, so much for sharing, and also a lot of inside knowledge of your organization and your also personal ideas and personal experience. I think it was really, really amazing talk, and can't wait for the second one with our community. So we will see you in about a month, I believe.
Well, and can I just say thank you to all of you too for the space here. I didn't do as much listening as I wish I had. Now I'm like, wait, I have all of these questions about things, but I know we can talk about them in different contexts. And Clara, I just want to say thank you too. You have been so incredibly helpful in supporting me to come to this conversation. So I'm just like immensely grateful for that as well. So thank you. And Ola too, we got to have a wonderful conversation beforehand. So just nothing but gratitude. And I hope this, in addition to the next session, I hope there's also other ways that we can share ideas, resources, other things like, thank goodness for Zoom and email right now. We're able to really breach all kinds of time zones and geographical stances. So I'm just...
we had the whole conversation on time zones. But we're also not opposed to coming to Seattle once we invite us. Like, all options are open for us.
Please, I would love nothing more than to host y'all, so please.
We know that you have dogs already. Okay, I think that we can continue now on private Zoom call. But for now, thank you so much, and thank you everyone. And we'll see you on the other webinar in slightly different form, but also inspiring. Thank you, and have a good Katie, and have a good night, everyone else, because it's 8 p.m.
Yes, good night, everybody.